All right, so welcome everybody. My name is Larry Solomon. I'm a technical evangelist in the automation business unit here at CA Technologies. Welcome to session, what is this, AUT 35T. They changed that, it wasn't that number before. This is about extending the Automic platform using actions that you develop yourself, or what we call custom action packs. I need to remind everybody that everything in this session is, all of the content is for informational purposes only. Standard disclaimer applies. Let's talk about what we're going to show you in this session. So I do have a number of slides of content. I do have screenshots, don't worry. If you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. I do have another microphone, I believe, in here somewhere. Maybe not. Oh, here it is. So I can play Phil Donahue and run around the audience and give you the microphone. If you would like to wait until the very end, you are certainly allowed to do that too. What we're going to show you, we're going to give you we're going to set the context of what we're talking about a little bit. We'll describe what the difference is between those two things. We'll understand how prompt sets can allow you to collect data from the user, and then we'll talk you through the steps of creating a custom action. This is not meant for you to be able to walk out of here and say, oh, I'm all of a sudden an expert, but it will certainly expose you to the concepts and help you become familiar somewhat. And then we'll look at REST actions specifically, because REST APIs have an extra degree of complexity when you're dealing with sending requests and parsing responses back. And we've added specific capabilities for REST actions that greatly simplify the process. So we'll talk a little bit more about those in depth when we get to that section of the presentation. All right, so before we begin, this session is meant for people who do have some prior exposure to the product. Not like it's really required, but it certainly helps. Again, I do have screenshots quite a lot, and as I mentioned, please do not hesitate to ask questions. If we do run out of time, my booth is right behind everybody. I'm in number 709, right over there. I'm happy to answer questions after the session is over as well. Okay, so what are custom actions? What are action packs? You know, if you've seen the solution, you know, with regards to release automation, for example, you see people, they drag little action items off from a little library and drop it onto this canvas and connect some lines up. That's an action. The action packs that you can get from the marketplace are produced by our product management team, or the R&D team specifically, or maybe our partners, or some from the community, but you can also develop them yourself. They're really the same thing. They're just actions that you define. I created one here called sleep, that you can just drag on your workflow like you would anything else. Okay? They can contain prompt sets which will allow you to grab data from the user, just like the actions. You'll hear that theme happening a lot, just like the actions you get from the marketplace. And you can group them together by functionality. People say, well, does it really matter if I create an action in another action pack that exists, or do I create my own action pack? Really, the answer is it's up to you. But bear in mind that action packs can be exported as a whole. And so if you're working for an organization that's large enough where maybe you would want to share this content, maybe build a library of actions that integrate with the proprietary technology you're using internally, maybe you'll share that via some sort of source code management system, or you'll upload it to your private vault in our marketplace, which only your peers can access. You know, you're going to want to export that action pack. And so while it is up to you, I personally recommend you create a separate action pack for all of your own actions that you're going to develop. Now, prompt sets, if you haven't seen them, they are, like I said, they're a means for collecting data from the user. But as you can see over here, here's an example of a prompt set that you'll find. It contains data fields of various types. I got drop-down lists. I have free-form text fields. I have spin buttons, which allow you to select a number. You know, things along those lines. I've got date and time fields and so on and so forth, which really allow you to enhance the customer experience. No customer wants to say, okay, everything's a free-form text field. There's no way for me to determine, am I really supposed to put a number here, or am I not, or whatever. So that really kind of provides some guidance and increases the level of UX as far as your actions are concerned. We'll talk about those a little bit in a second. We'll see a little bit more about it in a slide or two. Now, the prompt sets that you create, you can specify default values if you like. You can specify that I would like this value for this prompt set field to come from a dynamic property that's elsewhere, or a static property that's already defined. Do everybody know what static and dynamic properties are? No? Yeah? Okay. So you can specify this is the the X path of my dynamic property. Now, realize these are default values, so regardless of what you put in there, the end user is going to still have the ability to override whatever you put, but it's meant more as a suggestion or something along those lines. Creating a prompt set in the field, and I believe the next slide has a screenshot of this, is really just a simple matter of saying, okay, here are the types of fields I can use, a text field, spin button. I'm literally going to drag that into a list. It's going to show me top down all of the fields that I want to collect, that I want to use to collect data from the user. And then I can specify the variable that I want to store that value in. So here I dragged the spin button. Oh shoot, where did I get it from? Number right here. I dragged it over here, and you can see I gave it the label seconds, and I'm going to store it into a variable called ampersand seconds. And you can see I can do all kinds of fun things, such as making it a read-only variable, or maybe I want to set the variable, set the value manually, give it a default value. I can put tooltips for mousing over and to kind of prompt the user what this is meant to be used for, that kind of stuff. You remember that variable because we'll see that being used later. Now, people will see that and they'll say, well, I know there's a variables tab. What's the purpose of the variables tab? This is more of an ARA usage type of a question, but for those of you who don't know, variables are really a way of bringing in data from elsewhere in the system in scope. So what I mean by that is, normally you're only able to access properties that are defined at the component level. With dynamic properties, you can kind of fudge that a bit because you can make a dynamic property be an expression that pulls from the application level or the environment level or whatever happens to be and builds this composite value for you. This is another way of being able to access things such as properties that are defined elsewhere, or maybe like system variables like run IDs and that kind of stuff. And they can immediately be consumed by the action that you're writing. All right? And as I said here, you can also use these both in not only in the process tab, but also in the pre and post process tabs as well. Now, when it comes to custom actions, there's 3 different types. We'll talk about them on the next slide. Maybe I'll just skip the next slide and talk about them here. CLI is your typical action. I don't know if you've ever double-clicked on one of the pre-built actions. You see you have that split workflow. That's on the next slide, I believe. So you got the Windows on one side, and you got Unix on the other side. And for those of you who are using iSeries or mainframe, you're saying, well, what about us? Nobody's using that stuff? Okay, maybe it's just me. I'm the old guy who uses VMS stuff, right? So, so CLI is your typical Windows and Unix split workflow. REST, as I mentioned, is your typical REST APIs. There's some additional screens that allow you to really control the way that API is invoked and that the results are parsed. And then for everybody else, there's Composite, which basically means it's nothing. So if you're not Windows and you're not Unix and you want to be able to integrate with another type of platform that we support, you're going to have to use Composite and build everything yourself. It's a never-ending fight. I'm trying to get the other platforms built. So anyway, so like I said, CLI is your traditional split workflow like you see here. So here's my Windows, here's my Unix version down here. That's a CLI action that I created for my sleep action. Now, as I kind of hinted, I don't want people to think that, hey, you left the mainframe out. Come on, the mainframe is still, the backbone of my business. It's not like you've never been able to do. We've always had the ability to do actions that you could run on a mainframe. That capability's been there for years. But like I said, we support the Windows and the Unix stuff out of the box. So if you want to go to one of the types of environments other than that, you will have to use a composite workflow. Now with 12.1, we have started building action packs specifically for the mainframe, so you will find those in the marketplace like you would with any of the other integration points that we have. All right. Just like if you were using workload, the workload solution, the real meat and potatoes of what you're doing goes in the process tab. When I first started at Automic, the temptation was I'm going to build myself a CMD file or a PowerShell script, and I'm just going to reference it on the Windows tab instead. And people said, hold on, if you do that, you're responsible for maintaining that and uploading the latest version. You put it in the process tab. That way it gets transferred to the agent just like you would expect. And that way you don't have to worry about maintaining that stuff yourself. Again, REST actions will be discussed later, but you can see here how from that prompt set earlier, I stored the value in a variable called seconds. You can see how now I'm taking that variable from the prompt set and I'm using this in my ping statement, which is basically allowing me to sleep for a number of seconds. okay? Now, REST actions. Okay, so the REST protocol is well defined. It's basically an HTTP-based protocol. I invoke a URL, I specify some data, and then I get back a response in some format, whether it's XML or JSON or some other format, and then I'm responsible for parsing through that. Like I mentioned, the fact that the data comes back in these structured formats does make things a little more, I'd say complicated, but maybe involving. And instead of having to reinvent the wheel every single time, we've provided some facilities that allow you to handle REST invocations and the responses that come back a little more automatically. Okay, so first and foremost, we create some prompt sets for you. There's a really long name, and it ends with connection endpoint, which is where you specify not only the server name, but also the base path for the REST API interface. You can parameterize this, and that's critical when you're looking at, like, say, DevOps types of processes with ARA, because if you're deploying a REST service as part of your application, when you move to the next environment, your server names are going to change, for example, so you may want to parameterize that so that the URL endpoint contains the server in the next environment that you're moving to, so that when you test it, you're hitting the right version of the REST service. Okay? But this is, again, traditionally just the prefix part of it. The actual action and the parameters, which are specified in the latter part of the URI, is specified in the resource field. And I'll show you a screenshot of that in a second. So again, this contains data. It may contain the action name that you're trying to invoke as well. And again, it's going to vary based on the type of action that you're trying to invoke, as well as the parameters you're passing. You can pull that data from a prompt set like you would with anything else. And you can see here's a sample of what I've got. I apologize for the small amount of screenshot, but I want to make sure everybody can see it. So you can see I've got the request tab. I'm trying to invoke a REST API. When I did this, I was using a publicly available one on the internet, and it required a parameter called the post number. So I put that in there. Okay. This is a gotcha that you have to be aware of. We don't assume anything. You invoke a REST API, we're going to do it exactly the way you tell us to do it. Where this can become a problem is if you're interfacing or integrating with a REST API that somebody else built, they may have restrictions on the way you invoke it. For example, with that publicly accessible one that I was just referring to, that web service or the REST API returned the typical ipsum lorem text that you see when you're doing publishing. And they would not give me a valid response until I specified the user agent header. So if you have to do that, you can do that, but don't assume that we're going to do it for you, because we don't. So in the request header section of the request part, I can specify, add this header, here's the value for you. That way you have complete control over the way the REST API is invoked. I'm seeing a lot of chatter. Any questions? Not that it's okay if you are, I just didn't know if there was anything you had questions about. Please don't hesitate. Please, I didn't mean that. So if you had questions, I wanted you to ask. Don't be afraid of it. So here's where the interesting part comes into play, because the response, like I said, is structured data. And so there's a lot of text, and a lot of it may not be relevant to what you're looking to consume. Maybe you only need to extract out a part of it. We give you the ability to specify what you're going to extract, and we do provide assistance when making sure that you're getting the right value out. So in the response area, you can say, this is what I need. It's a JSON set of data. I want you to save it as a variable. Here's the variable name, and here's the expression. Now this is where it gets interesting. So I got $.title. I know it's an eye chart in the back. You really can't see it. I'll show you that in a second. If you push the test button over here, then you get this really interesting window that pops up. It's this. This is basically gives you the ability to check out what it is you're trying to extract to make sure you get the right expression. So I can say, replace this field with the result of the last invocation that I did. So then it automatically pulls it out the results. It puts it in here, and then I can type in expressions and say, this is a JSON path expression here. Evaluate, and it gives me the results of it. pretty nifty because it allows you to validate that you're getting the correct data out of the response rather than you have to do it blindly and then you're doing trial by error and you're spending 15 million years just trying to figure out the correct expression to get the value that you want. Okay? Again, as I mentioned, that expression tester allows you to really rapidly prototype what you're trying to do. Now, this is a bit of a gotcha as well. So a lot of customers, they take advantage of pre and post conditions. With REST actions, it becomes a little bit convoluted because of those additional panels when you're using the built-in user interface for creating REST. Can everybody still hear me? Yeah, okay, good. When you're using the built-in functionality to create REST actions, I couldn't hear myself, that's why I was asking. They don't give you the typical pre and post process tabs. It's all request and response. So if you do need to add that functionality, what you end up having to do is then create an additional composite step, and all it does is invoke the REST API, and that composite step can then be used for pre and post processing. Where it becomes, well, I'll show you this first before I continue. So you can see I've got the typical, little darker gray box to indicate that I've got a post step in here and I've got my stuff here, the conditions and the actions to take, as you would expect normally. I didn't put the caveat. The interesting thing about that is, however, is that if you do that, while you will expose the composite one, which contains the pre and post conditions, there's no way to prevent the base REST API, at least not that I know of, and I've tried. There's no way to prevent that base REST action from also being exposed to the user. So that's something to keep in mind.